This is the story of the White Lady's Lament. I'm a photographer by trade. Not the kind who takes wedding portraits or family pictures, but the kind who seeks out decay, desolation, and urban blight. I find a stark, brutal beauty in places left to rot. That's how I ended up in Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. My online friends, mostly other urban explorers and ghost hunters, called it one of the most haunted places in America. They talked about strange lights, orbs, and the ghost of a faceless woman. I called it a prime location for a new photo series. I was a skeptic, you see. I believed in composition, light, and shadow, not in things that went bump in the night. Ghosts were just a narrative, a backstory to make a crumbling old graveyard more interesting. I was going to prove it. I arrived at dusk, just as the sun was bleeding a deep, bruised purple across the horizon. The cemetery was tucked away off a lonely country road, barely marked. The air was thick and heavy, and a fine mist was already rising from the overgrown grass, clinging to the crooked headstones. The stones themselves were old, some tilted, some broken, all forgotten. I felt a sense of history, a weight of time, but not fear. I set up my tripod and my camera, the digital display a bright alien rectangle in the fading light. The air grew colder, and a profound silence settled over the place. A silence so complete, it felt like an actual presence. My only companions were the skeletal branches of the trees and the crooked, silent monuments. The first hint of something wrong was not a sound, but the absence of one. The buzzing of the insects, the rustling of leaves, it all just stopped. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Then a new sound came, and it was the sound that changed everything. A distant cry. It was high-pitched, thin, and desperate. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby. I paused, my hand on my camera, a little knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I told myself it was just a fox, or maybe someone had left their window open and a sound had carried on the wind. But the cry was too human, too full of pain. It came again, a long, drawn-out wail that seemed to slice through the heavy silence and hang in the cold air. I ignored it, or tried to. I focused on my composition, on framing a shot of a particularly ancient-looking headstone, half swallowed by the weeds. But the sound came again, closer this time, and I could swear I heard the faint sound of weeping, a soft, sorrowful sound that followed the baby's cry. I spun around, my heart now pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The mist was thicker now, a pale, milky blanket. And through that blanket, I saw it, a figure. It was indistinct at first, just a pale smear of white against the dark backdrop of the trees. It moved without a sound, gliding between the rows of graves, a silent, ghostly apparition. It was a woman in a long, flowing dress, and she was carrying something in her arms. I didn't run. My instincts, honed by a life of logical thinking, told me it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination, or maybe some local kids trying to scare people. I steadied my hands and raised my camera, trying to focus on the figure. As I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. The figure was a woman in a white dress, old and ornate, the kind you would see in a museum. She was indeed holding something small in her arms, like a bundled blanket, but her head was a dark, featureless void. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an empty space, a profound, terrifying emptiness. The sight of it was a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a physical absence, it was the chilling sense that her face had been completely erased, as if her identity had been utterly and completely lost. And then she turned to me, not with a sudden jerk, but a slow, deliberate turn, as if she was responding to my gaze. I could feel her looking at me, even though there was nothing to look with. A wave of an indescribable sadness washed over me, a sorrow so deep and ancient, it felt like it could swallow the entire cemetery whole. It was the kind of pain that feels like a physical weight on your chest, a grief so pure it hurts to breathe. And then the baby cried again, a sharp, piercing shriek that was not just sound, but a feeling of intense, agonizing despair. It was the sound of a mother's heartbreak, the sound of a life lost before it had even begun. I dropped my camera. The sound of it hitting the ground was a small, insignificant crunch in the vast, suffocating silence. I stumbled back, not taking my eyes off the figure. It was close enough now that I could see the material of her dress, a shimmering white that almost seemed to glow in the darkness. The baby's wailing intensified, and I felt it in my very bones. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, as if she had been waiting for my complete surrender, the woman in white and the crying infant dissolved into the mist. They didn't disappear. They simply faded, becoming one with the pale fog, leaving me alone once again. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body shaking uncontrollably. The silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It was a loaded silence, a silence filled with the echo of a baby's cry and a mother's silent grief. I looked at the spot where she had vanished. The grass was flattened, and a small antique baby shoe lay there, wet and cold to the touch. It was a small, material piece of evidence, a souvenir from a place that should not exist, a place where sorrow never died. I picked it up, and a profound, bone-deep coldness spread through my hand, a cold that I knew would never truly leave. I left the cemetery, but I didn't leave the horror behind. I tried to live my life normally. I sold my camera and my lenses. I stopped taking photographs. But every night, as I lie in bed, I still hear it, the faint, distant cry of a baby. Sometimes I can hear a soft, mournful weeping. It's a sound only I can hear. The White Lady didn't just haunt the cemetery. She haunted me. She gave me her sorrow, a sorrow that I now carry with me every day. The baby shoe sits on my nightstand, a constant chilling reminder that some stories aren't just stories. They are living, breathing nightmares that wait for you in the dark. This is the story of the Howling Hill. College is full of stupid ideas, and ours was to take a road trip to Kansas. Not for any good reason, mind you. We weren't going to visit family or see a concert. We were going because we'd heard about Stull Cemetery, a place local legends called a gateway to hell. It was just a small, run-down graveyard on a hill, but the myths had made it famous among urban explorers and ghost hunters. A lot of kids our age went there, looking for a cheap thrill. We were no different. My friends, Kyle, Mark, and Sarah, were all about the adventure. I was the one who went along because it was better than sitting at home. I wasn't a believer. I thought it was just a bunch of old stones and overblown folklore. The perfect place for a good scare, maybe, but nothing real. I was wrong about that. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long, crooked shadows from the old tombstones. Stull Cemetery was exactly as described, small, desolate, and eerily quiet. The trees were twisted and gnarled, and the tombstones, many from the 1800s, were worn down, some so old you couldn't even read the names. There was an old, crumbling stone church without a roof, its empty frame like a gaping mouth aimed at the sky. A local we'd met in town had given us a warning. Don't go to that hill after dark. The devil walks there. We just laughed, but looking at the place in the fading light, a shiver ran down my spine. The air was cold, even though it was a warm night. We set up our small campsite a short distance from the cemetery fence. A few sleeping bags and a small fire that crackled half-heartedly in the stillness. The initial thrill wore off as the darkness deepened. The laughs died down, replaced by a nervous quiet. We sat around the fire, staring into the flames, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The wind started to pick up, a low, moaning sound that whistled through the rusty fence posts. And then we heard the first sound. That wasn't the wind, a distant chuckle. It was high-pitched and dry, like old leaves being crushed. We all froze. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered. Mark, the bravest among us, tried to dismiss it. "It's just the wind, man," echoing off the stones. But then it came again. A second laugh, and this time it was closer. It was an ugly, malicious sound, a cackle full of malice and joy. It sounded like it was coming from inside the graveyard itself. We all huddled closer to the fire, our eyes scanning the darkness between the gravestones. The shadows seemed to lengthen and writhe, taking on strange, distorted shapes. Kyle, who had been quiet the whole time, suddenly stood up. "I'm going to take a leak," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'll be right back." "Dude, don't go alone," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He just shook his head and walked off into the darkness toward the trees. We sat there, staring into the embers of the fire, listening. We heard the rustle of leaves as he moved away. Then the laughter came again. It was a single, piercing burst of cackling right on the edge of the tree line. This time, it was unmistakably inhuman. It was too fast, too vicious, and it was followed by the sound of Kyle's frantic footsteps, a desperate, scrambling noise as he ran back towards us. He burst into the small circle of light from our fire, his face pale, his eyes wide with pure terror. He was panting, clutching his chest. Something chased me," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I saw it. It was small, hunched over. Its eyes were red. We didn't need to ask for more." We started packing our stuff, our hands shaking. The laughter started up again, and this time it was everywhere. It echoed from the stones, from the trees, from the very air. It was a chorus of pure, malevolent glee. We could hear quick, scuttling footsteps all around us, a sound like tiny claws on stone, scraping and scratching. It was getting closer. "Get in the car," Mark yelled. "Now!" We scrambled, tossing our gear into the back of my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. The engine coughed to life, and we all piled in. Mark was in the passenger seat, and Sarah was in the back with Kyle, who was curled into a ball, still shaking. I slammed the truck into gear and drove, the wheels spinning in the soft mud before we lurched forward. We were about to hit the main road when Sarah screamed. "Look!" she shrieked, pointing at the rearview mirror. For a brief, horrifying second, I saw it. A small, hunched-over figure, no taller than a child, was clinging to the back of my truck. Its body was gnarled and twisted, its skin like old cracked leather. Its eyes were two burning red embers, and its mouth was stretched into a wide, terrifying grin filled with jagged, pointed teeth. And as it clung there, swaying with the movement of the truck, it was laughing. A high-pitched guttural cackle that I could hear even over the sound of the engine. My foot hit the gas, and I sped down the road, leaving the cemetery far behind. I didn't slow down until we were miles away, driving through the quiet, suburban streets of a small town. The laughter eventually faded, and the terrifying image in the rearview mirror was replaced by the ordinary sights of streetlights and houses. We were all silent, the earlier bravado completely gone. We drove for hours, not speaking, until the sun came up and we felt safe enough to stop. We never went back to Stull Cemetery. We all tried to move on, to forget what we saw. We told ourselves it was just our minds playing tricks on us, or a local prank that went too far. But some things you can't unsee. Kyle had a hard time sleeping for months. He said he kept waking up to the sound of something scratching at his bedroom door. Sarah and Mark had their own nightmares. But for me, it was the laughter, the dry, malicious cackle. I would be at work or walking down the street, and I would suddenly hear it. Just a faint, brief sound, like a memory playing back. A memory of pure, unadulterated evil. It was no longer coming from the outside. It was inside my head. I went to a doctor, a therapist. They told me it was a form of post-traumatic stress. But I know better. That laugh, it's a part of me now. It's the sound of a demon, forever bound to a hill in Kansas, and to a night that I can never forget. Every time I hear it, I know it's a reminder that some gates should never be opened, and some places should be left alone. This is the final story in the series. Story 3, The Empty Man of Sleepy Hollow. This is the story of the empty man of Sleepy Hollow. I'd always considered myself a pragmatist. For 10 years, I worked the night shift as a security guard at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York. People would ask me about the Headless Horseman, and I'd just smile and tell them the legends were great for tourism. To me, a cemetery wasn't a place of ghouls and ghosts. It was a quiet, sprawling park filled with history and peaceful silence. My job was simple: patrol the grounds, check the gates, and make sure no one was vandalizing the graves. It was a perfect, solitary job for a man like me. I was a professional, a believer in the real and the tangible. My professional detachment began to crack one rainy night in the middle of October. The kind of rain that falls heavy and cold, soaking everything to the bone. As I drove my patrol cart along the winding paths, my headlights cut through the downpour, reflecting off the slick, dark granite of the old tombstones. It was a dreary night, and I was the only soul for miles. Or so I thought. As I rounded a corner near the oldest section of the cemetery, my headlights fell upon a figure standing perfectly still between two massive mausoleums. My heart gave a little jolt. It was a man, dressed in a dark coat, holding a black umbrella. He wasn't moving, just standing there. Under the relentless rain, I pulled the cart to a stop and turned off the engine. The only sound was the drumming of rain on the cart's roof. My first thought was that he was a lost tourist, a bizarrely dedicated goth kid, or a family member visiting a grave in the middle of the night. It was against the rules, but I had a kind heart. I honked my horn lightly. The man didn't move. I honked again, a little longer this time. Still nothing. My gut told me something was wrong. My professionalism kicked in, and I got out, grabbing my flashlight. "Sir," I called out, my voice swallowed by the rain. "The cemetery is closed. You'll have to leave." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, a still, dark silhouette under the black umbrella. The rain seemed to pour off him, but he didn't twitch, didn't shiver. He was a statue made of shadow and rain. A strange unease began to creep over me. I approached him cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. As I got closer, I could make out the details of his coat. It was an old, heavy trench coat, and it looked saturated, as if it had been submerged in water. It was dripping, but there was no sound of a drip, just the silent flow of water. I could now see the top of his head, covered by a black bowler hat, and the umbrella's shadow that completely obscured his face. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, or I'll call the police," I said, my voice firmer now, but with a slight tremor I couldn't hide. He still didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest. This was beyond odd. This was wrong. I was only a few feet from him, and I could feel a strange cold radiating from him that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a deep, unfeeling cold, like the cold of an empty space. He began to move, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a fresh wave of dread through me. He lowered his umbrella, just enough for me to see his head, still obscured by the shadow of the hat. And then he slowly, very slowly, tilted his head up. My flashlight beam, white and sharp, landed directly on his face. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't scream. I just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer, unholy horror of it. There were no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, pale, empty expanse of skin where a face should be. It wasn't a ghost with distorted features or a shadowy face. It was a void, a complete, terrifying blank. The sight of it was a profound violation of everything I knew to be real. My mind, built on logic and reality, simply couldn't process it. It was like trying to stare directly into a black hole. My brain screamed, trying to force me to look away, but I couldn't. I was mesmerized by the terrible emptiness. He stood there, motionless, his face a perfect blank canvas. The rain poured down, but it seemed to part around him, falling off his coat without a sound. He was absorbing the rain, not just getting wet. I felt a chill so intense, it felt like my very soul was being frozen. My flashlight began to flicker, its light pulsing in time with my frantic heartbeat. And then, without a sound, the man with no face just dissolved. He didn't vanish in a flash of light or a puff of smoke. He simply became transparent, like a reflection on glass, and then was gone. The sound of my own screams was deafening in the silence of the cemetery. I was alone, standing in the cold rain, my flashlight beam shaking uncontrollably in my hand. I ran back to the cart, fumbling with the keys, and sped out of the cemetery as fast as the little vehicle would go. I didn't stop until I got home, and even then I couldn't stop shaking. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to set foot in that place again. The police just thought I was a paranoid old man who had finally cracked under the pressure of working a lonely job. But I knew the truth. Every time it rains now, I feel it. That same cold presence. I see him. Not in my house, not as a full apparition, but in the reflections. The reflection in my window when it rains, the fleeting shadow on the wall, the patterns of raindrops on the glass. For a brief, terrifying second, I'll see a blank, featureless face staring back at me. I'll see the empty man of Sleepy Hollow, still waiting for something. They say he was a man who drowned in a flood and was never found. His soul is lost, and so is his face. And now, I carry a small, empty part of him with me, a ghost of an encounter that will haunt me forever.